what happens when women get power. So when men get power, they build societies, they do awesome things. When women get power, we're just not very good with it.
What do you think about that?
Depends on how you define power, like economic power, like bureaucratic power, like executive power. Like, so if we're talking, like, because she's using these words in these kind of like pithy ways where you can't really categorically rebut it because it's convenient because it's vague. It's what she typically does is Mott and Bailey is she consistently makes like Mott and Bailey claims where it's like a broad, like kind of absurd statement. And then she's pressed on details and then it's like caveat, 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 caveat. And that's kind of like what Rachel was doing with respect to her tweets. She'll like say something. Sure, people say absurd things like on the Twitter timeline. And then when they're pressed in video format, suddenly like their 10 with respect to outrage is like a 5.5 when they're actually like forced to elaborate and defend their claim. So it kind of depends on what you mean by power.
Would you agree that there's a lot of marketing that goes into this bullshit though, and that like she's good at marketing though?
Oh, like she's absolutely astonishing. She's a master of her craft.
Yeah, I mean, like, and it's not even just that, but I like by the end of this video, I think they really get to the message, and I think that's what I wonder what your opinion is on that. So.
Hitler. I mean, I kind of feel like there's a lot of bad dudes, you know?
Well, yeah, but there's also bad queens, right? If you look at queens the last 500 years, women are more likely to wage war. Women are way more violent with power. And we see that in society. Look at what women are doing in the court system today. And what is more evil than breaking up a family? And women do that.
Elizabeth I.
What did you say?
So oftentimes, like, unless she's referring to a meta-analysis of like, there really wasn't that many female monarchs with respect, like, with like totalizing power. If we're excluding examples like Elizabeth II, where there's actually like a parliamentary like system in place where they're just a figurehead. But Elizabeth I was the reason the whole like the British Empire was created. That was Elizabeth I, and it was because, and that's precisely also why she didn't marry. She never married, so she never had to concede power to a king, and partly that's because she wanted to kind of like continue the legacy of her family. I'm rough on the history of like the Tudors and all of that stuff, but she was very industrious, and her actions like during her reign were the reason the British Empire was set up to become what it was. And she was also the one funding a lot of like, because during this time the British Empire was broke. It had no money. And so she was very industrious. She actually took lands from her father and she took the lumber from those lands and built a fleet of ships. So she kind of like sacrificed the lands that were like in her family owned like by the royalty to create basically a royal navy. And that royal navy that she started with her own kind of resources was the precursor to the famous British Royal Navy. And so history is a lot more nuanced and kind of like, you know, you can retcon a narrative, but there's a lot of things going on. And there's a lot of like contradicting kind of, or like contrapoints, but Elizabeth I is an interesting, there's also a bunch of other interesting stuff with respect to Hermeticism and alchemy and her funding John Dee, but that's a whole different story.
Yeah, but whenever it comes to women being more evil, you know, like that crazy claim that she keeps making, what do you think about that? You know, like something I always bring up is that historically women did commit infanticide and like kill a lot of their kids, you know, like because it would be hard to have a kid sometimes, especially if they got knocked up by the wrong guys or something. Like, do you think that women have like a little bit of evil in them? And sometimes there is a halo effect, and women do get pedestalized by society because they, you know, like they're perfect and they can't do no wrong. But would you say that like there are some there is a good amount of evil, like because Pearl makes this stance all the time that like women are super fucking evil, like way worse than dudes are. But I mean, dudes murder and, you know, or, you know, shit, I was supposed to say that. But like, you get what I'm saying? Like, what do you think about like an argument against that?
So I think if you're going to make that argument, if you're going to invoke the concept of evil, that's obviously a religious concept, right? So you're inherently making a religious argument because evil is a little more about like you can say a person commits antisocial acts, but to say they are committing acts of evil, or they're doing that, an act out of an intrinsic evil, is a completely different argument, right? And like now you have to define evil. And like oftentimes like there's entire fields dedicated to the air quote problem of evil. But I like the working definition, evil as the absence of good. So I don't think like, so if we define someone as having a little bit of evil, that's defining them as having like an absence, a part of their kind of motivation structure that is, there's a part of that is, there's a vacuum of good in that motivation structure. I would say like from a religious cosmology, we have to say that's true of all people. If we are like adhering to like an Abrahamic like creation cosmology, which is true. So I believe that men and women have like, I believe they're in that framework, their evil kind of manifests in different ways. For example, men tend to do evil through action. Women tend to do evil through omission of action, like not doing something or kind of a gesture. So when men are trying to act, even you can kind of see this in suicides too. For example, when men want to commit suicide, right, they're much more successful. Women commit about 70% of all attempted suicides are female, while about 70% of all actual suicides are male. So that's kind of that example, that dichotomy of like action versus gesture, where when women, and it's not necessarily attention seeking, it's more like a manifestation of a woman kind of saying she gives up. It's often like depression, but it's like to act that concretely and definitively is not necessarily, if we're getting to Jungian archetypes, that's not a feminine archetype. And so for a woman to like kill herself is a very masculine act. And that's like, it's acting definitively and it's acting finally, as opposed to kind of a gesture or or like creating the insinuation of an action or potential action. And so that we kind of see a similar pattern with crimes. Like female abuse of children tends to be neglect, or it tends to be like abuse via neglect, like I've seen a couple of these crime cases lately, leaving your child alone while you go to Disneyland for 4 days. Whereas male like acts of crime or violence, like, or that would be manifestations of evil, tend to be a kind of overt affirmative act. But it's also interesting because like, now that you kind of see how this manifests in the criminal justice system, we do tend to punish like a direct action more than we punish kind of a I'm stuttering right now. Gesticulation. I think it's how you say it, of an action. And so it's, if you premeditate and you act decisively and you plan ahead of time, that's obviously first degree or second degree. Whereas if you fail to act and your child dies, as opposed to you like kill your child, that'd be third degree. That's like voluntary manslaughter, or what would be? It would be there'd probably be upgraded charges because oftentimes in these cases there's like 15 or 20 charges tacked on. So maybe the differential ends up being leveled out. But like, in this like schema most people are like familiar with, people like the affirmative kind of decisive act is punished harsher and more decidedly than kind of an omission of act, or like the insinuation of act, or like kind of letting things take its course, but setting up the situation for it to take its course.